Before I introduce our distinguished speakers, I'd like to thank the Art Gallery of New South Wales. I'd also like to thank the speakers for, in one case, coming from Brisbane. And I would also like to thank all of you for coming today. This is a day I never thought I would ever see, partly because you're here, but also because this project started in a conversation in London about 6 years ago, when I was looking at the opening ceremony of the Olympics, if you remember that year, and remembering all of the kind of great pageant of Chinese history that was being shown then, and thinking how much of this, how many of these figures that are being shown in front of a global audience would really make a great deal of sense to those who were not Chinese. And it made me think actually that there were very few places that you could go to get a straightforward, simple guide to Chinese figures, to Chinese historical figures. There was much great scholarly literature. There was some amazing chronological histories like the Cambridge histories, the multi-volume histories. But really, if you wanted to go somewhere accessible as your first stop, where could you go? And this discussion I had with the publisher, Karen Christensen of Berkshire Publishing in America, really started thinking of maybe doing a dictionary of Chinese biography. The first dictionary of Chinese biography was done by Herbert Giles in 1898, and therefore was a little bit out of date. And we thought, although it was a bold idea, that we would try and do something which would involve experts and scholars from throughout the world to write maybe 100, 150 entries about key figures. Why? Well, I guess everyone knows that Chinese history is very long. Some people think it's 4,000 years, some people 5,000, but it's certainly a pretty daunting sight when you stand at the base of this vast Alps of events and happenings and you try and make sense of it. And really, the only thing that helps us in the journey through this history is chronology. It has a beginning and it's kind of going on now, so we can say that now is, at least for the moment, the end. And this is an alien culture in many ways, not an alien in a nasty sense, but alien in as much as many of the names are very hard to remember, many of the cultural symbols, many of the kind of contexts are difficult to understand for those who are not born in this culture. And therefore, if you have chronology, that's about the only thing that helps you through. There are no easy threads, as I say in the introduction. The dynasties fragment sometimes. There's no simple way of saying that at one particular point, for instance, about 1,000 years ago at the end of the Great Tang Dynasty, there was a sort of moment of a kind of multiple Chinas, and therefore lots and lots of opportunity for confusion. And therefore, we really kind of have to keep track of that timeline. But how do we do it? Well, I looked at the great historian Sima Qian from the Han Dynasty 2,000 years ago and looked at the incredible records of the historians, one of the great world classics. And I thought, well, that would be an inspiration because it's a story of the life of China, the Chinas that existed up until that period in the Han Dynasty, around about the time of Christ, 2,000 years ago, through people and people's voices. And in fact, it may well be the world's first psychohistory, psychological history. It has this sort of extraordinary way, Sima Qian, of capturing people's characters and people's habits and really telling the story of the China that existed until then through those people. It's also, most importantly, a history of stories, very vivid and very powerful stories that convey something of the nature and spirit of the times that Sima Qian was writing about. So I thought in the 21st century there probably was a role for an update of that. Not, of course, that I'm claiming that I'm Sima Qian, not least because he ended up castrated. He offended the emperor. I'm sure there are many days in which my Vice-Chancellor, Michael, may think of many things to do to me, but I'm sure I won't have that fate. Well, I think that this dictionary, which is now finished and complete, and it's an amazing tribute to the publisher, Karen Christensen, and her team, that they did this in such a short period, got the final editorial work done. This is a history that tries to make those histories, those people, those voices accessible and manageable, and to make it less intimidating. In the first 3 volumes, there are 105 entries from people from 12 countries and regions, many of them from America, many of them from China, so it's a genuine international collaborative event. The entries are from 5 to 8,000 words. There are no footnotes. Thank goodness. Footnotes sometimes can be a real problem, but they are by world-leading experts. So they are authoritative, and they've been written by, in many cases, people who have studied their areas for many, many years, some of whom are my colleagues at the University of Sydney, Geoff Eagle, who unfortunately couldn't be here today as he's abroad, but also Esther Klein, who's here, and others who have managed to write some of the entries from their deep experience and study. And therefore, I suppose in conclusion, I have to say, of course, when people look at this dictionary, they will point out that there aren't particular figures, that it lacks maybe certain people that it should have covered. That's, I guess, inevitable. It is, I suppose, a little bit arbitrary, but I wanted really to capture not just the imperial history, but also the history of culture, the history of science. So we have figures like Bi Xiang, the Song dynasty scientist. We have figures like Cao Xueqing, the great author of The Dream of the Red Mansion. We have figures who are from the cultural life of China, and also mythical figures right at the very beginning. So it starts right at the beginning of the partly known history of China. And I hope, therefore, that this dictionary, with the people that have contributed to it so generously and who have been amazing to work with over the last 6 years, this is a way of helping people engage with this amazing history, this rich history of stories, of vivid personalities that has shaped China today, because that history obviously really matters. But I thought it would be good today for us to listen to the wisdom of others, and therefore I'm really glad to introduce our first speaker. He is, I think, widely known in these buildings and in this place, Edmund Capon. When I talked to him originally about the dictionary a few months ago when we were having lunch, I explained the rationale, and he immediately was incredibly warm in his response, and so I'm really grateful for him coming here today to say a few words. Edmund.
Oh, yeah, never been here before. We built this. Well, thank you, Kerry. Actually, you said something just now about sort of learning about cultures and learning about unfamiliar worlds. And of course, the two things that locate cultural history are indeed chronology and geography. And I think that that's particularly pertinent in the case of China. I want to talk about something just slightly tangential to that, really. Everybody here knows that anybody who studies the history of China knows only too well that the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And so it goes on. And a lifetime of study really can lead, at best it seems, to a mere glimpse into that extraordinary and all-consuming history. We all know, and we're always reminded by our Chinese colleagues, that China has the longest still surviving civilization and culture. It's true, you know. I mean, the great civilizations of the ancient world, of Mesopotamia, Egypt, ancient Greece and Rome, even the Near East and India, or the subcontinent of India, they're all mere shadows of their former glory, owing to their sort of dilution and diversity. But the essentials of Chinese culture remain. And what we see today is the natural inheritor of 2 millennia or more ago. But every now and then something amazing turns up. And this very morning, I opened a letter at home. I'm not very good at opening letters. It's probably been sitting around for a week. And somebody sent me this article, China's Great Museum League, which was published, I think, in just a week ago. In December. And it said here, in 1949, China had just 25 museums. Now they are building an average of over 100 a year. I mean, it's just just one little incident of the change that is happening there. So I think it's little wonder that when people do, Westerners like us, do become fascinated by China, somehow it never goes away. It's something that absolutely lives with you. And even bearing in mind the immense frustrations of our inevitably superficial grasp of things, we seldom abandon China. People often ask me, I say, well, how come you got so interested in China? It was one of those things I'll just tell you very quickly. I was 10 years old, I was at boarding school, I loved geography, and there was my geography book, and on the left-hand page of the geography book, I was doing my prep at boarding school, there was a grainy black and white photograph of the Great Wall of China. And I looked at that and I said, not sure that really exists because I know I shall never see it. And from that moment on, I had to get there. And I will just go back a moment because I actually first went in 1972 towards the end of the Cultural Revolution, or it's still going, a group of 8 Maoists, pseudo-Maoists from London. We piled on, arrived in Shanghai, where I think there was one light bulb at the time, and spent 5 weeks in schools, in Carter camp, well, only the junior schools, everything was closed, Carter camps, factories making little red tractors, and the most extraordinary thing. And you went back and you said, how on earth could it be that we were all on the same planet? I mean, the world, the life there was so dramatically different. And, we, of course, were objects of the greatest curiosity. And wherever you went, you were surrounded by hundreds, thousands of bewildered onlookers. And it made one think just about how did those very first Europeans feel when they encountered China. After tumultuous travels around the world, they arrived there. Like Matteo Ricci, for example, the only non-Chinese in the dictionary. And it made me think about something. Before I came here, I was at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And one of my projects was, I spent days and days in the wonderful room at the British Museum called the Department of Oriental Printed Books and Manuscripts. And I was going through a book called the Huangchao Li Qi Tushi, which is a kind of sort of illustrated regulations of court dress and etiquette, blah, 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 put out by the Qianlong Emperor. First published, I think, I got it down, in 1759. But the copy that the British Museum had was 1796. So there I was with these huge volumes, day after day, going through this, working out, court robes and this and that, looking at all this stuff. And I thought, suddenly made me realise this book was made in China just 3 years after the McCartney mission to China. Suddenly you realise and puts these things into a kind of perspective. And about the extraordinary abyss that existed between our two worlds. But now, what changes we've seen in China? Isn't it extraordinary what's happened? When I first went, I had one little incident I recall, and I'll just recount very quickly. One day in 1972, September, I was with somebody from the Luxingshi, everybody wore the same clothes, there was no cars, there was only bicycles, and we were walking across Wangfujing, which is now the serious shopping street. Then it was a completely fraudulent shopping street because there weren't any shops. And we were walking through all these bicycles. And she turned to me and she said, we have a terrible traffic problem here in Beijing. I said, I beg your pardon? And she said, well, look at all these bicycles. I said, look, if this was Oxford Street or Piccadilly in London, all these bicycles would be cars. And she took 2 more steps, still surrounded by this sea of bicycles. She looked at me and said, what did you say? I said, well, if this was London, all these bicycles would be cars. And she looked at me and she said, good heavens, does your government own so many cars? And I spent the next 5 weeks trying to persuade that actually, the likes of us had a car, but didn't succeed. I think we all tend to think of the times in which we live as fairly dramatic. But I think, in retrospect, history dissolves that drama into mere evolution. And when you look at, I've been reading a lot more about recent history of China in the last couple of 100 years, and when you look what's happened there over the last 150 years. Now that is dramatic history. It is extraordinary what's happened in China in the last 2 centuries. Just think of the fall of the dynastic system in 1911. I mean, that was a completely change of history. And then the foreign interventions, then the establishment of the People's Republic, and now in the last 3 decades, a transformation that has brought with amazing suddenness, I think, hitherto unknown economic, political and cultural clout to China. Just think of the examples. Think of tourism. I mean, 10 years ago, really there was no such creature as a Chinese tourist. Now there's busloads here, there's busloads there. You go down to Bondi, there's busloads. Even here, when I was here, we'd have 5 or 6 busloads of Chinese tourists a day to the Art Gallery of New South Wales. And think of the art market in my part of the world. You go to Sotheby's and Christie's Chinese sales in London, the bulk of the business is Chinese dealers and Chinese collectors. It's quite extraordinary. The amazing recent history of China makes it all the more imperative that if we wish to remain, as I know we all do, consistent and reliable partners, neighbours, co-respondents with China, then we had better learn a lot more about the whys and wherefores of our history, culture, sensibilities, aspirations and values. I really see a desperate need for that to happen. And to be honest, I remain slightly bewildered at the seeming reluctance of this country to take Asia seriously, and China in particular. I mean, Asian languages are still not de rigueur in our schools. I find it extraordinary. And with just a hint of cynicism, I sometimes often think that the corporate world regards China as nothing more than an economic opportunity. Well, even if that is the limit of interest, if it is to be fulfilled, it will need much more than the present levels of knowledge and interest to sustain it. But I look at all this from a personal point of view as well. You know, my interest in Chinese art, in the small world of the visual arts, and see what's happened recently. Last year, I was very kindly asked by the White Rabbit Gallery to do a show film, which, I hope you might have seen it. I think it's finished now, actually. Is it? Yeah. And it brought home to you the fact that obviously there's the mainstream traditional aesthetic and sensibility in the art of China today, but then there's this parallel course, this parallel trajectory of artists wanting to engage on a global level with the rest of the world. And, like so much of contemporary China, these artists see themselves as part of a much wider world and want to be part of that larger world, but without necessarily, and typically, I think, really abandoning their Chineseness. And I think that's just, the art world in China now is just one small glimpse into the new reality of 21st century China. And the fact is, there is absolutely no doubt that never before in its entire history has China been so engaged with the rest of the world as now. And I suppose that's true of many countries and many emerging countries. But when one is dealing with a culture of such immense history and cohesion and still definition, it takes on, I think, a rather more significant substance. And so I go on about my hobby horse, really, which is about learning about Asia and about China. Not necessarily in any huge and substantive way, but sufficient to recognize and to feel comfortable with Asian nations, peoples, customs and textures. And that means an engagement with history, with culture, faiths, ideas, geography, and to find our common ground and also to appreciate unique characteristics. And this is, again, coming quickly back to the dictionary. Giles, indeed, 1898, what I think it was, Herbert Giles. I still have that, I still use that. It's got some really wonderful things in it. They all have wonderful things, but I quite by chance, I found something in there the other day, I mean, how do you put this into a dictionary? This is not in this one. This was in Giles. A certain Meng Ye, 6th century, who governed the province of Hebei so wisely that the ears of corn suddenly sprouted 9 ears on a single stalk. It reminds me of the, in 1972, going to a factory, I think in Guangzhou, where they carved those ivory balls within balls. You know, they were carving away, and I thought, oh, is this really necessary? But still. And I said to this guy, I said, well, how many balls within balls can you carve? And he said, I could carve 10 balls within balls. I said, oh, but now I've learned to, must have been later, on a subsequent for 76, something like that, because since I've learned to, in the anti-Confucian campaign, because since I've learned to criticize Confucius, read Mao, criticize Confucius, I can carve 15 balls within balls. There. Anyway, I've had a quick glimpse at the dictionary, which is, it's as epic as China itself. It is an amazing panorama of the people who shaped Chinese history, and that is a big task. It's a big ask, but and its value will be absolutely enormous, not only to the layman, but to people like us, who are always on the treadmill of the history of China. We will, as I said, that's a journey that we're never going to abandon. But thank you for asking me to come along and say a few words, Kerry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edmund. And now I would like to ask one of our contributors. Colin McCarris has been going to China for 50 years now. I wouldn't make some cruel joke about him actually being personally acquainted with the Emperor Qianlong, but he has written the entry for Qianlong and for a number of other of the figures that we've covered, right from the Tang Dynasty. So this is, I think, is a sort of sign of Colin's incredible breadth of scholarship, and it's wonderful that he's here today. So if I could invite Professor McCarris.
Thanks very much for inviting me to come. I want to begin by congratulating Kerry and Berkshire for the publication of this dictionary. I think it's a wonderful achievement, and I think it fills a very big need. Giles, I also have Giles, the biographical dictionary. I also use it. I have used it quite a lot, actually, in the past, but I don't think I'll be using it very much from now on, because it's not nearly as good. And I think it is absolutely true what Kerry and others have said, that this is fulfills a need that is really very, very, very pressing for people who are interested in Chinese history. Now, a dictionary of Chinese biography presupposes the importance of Chinese history. And it seems to me that Chinese history has been quite marginalised. I agree with the sort of things that Edmund was saying. I think it's been marginalised by comparison with the histories of various other cultures. It hasn't been theorised properly, not in the same way that European, American history, etc., has been theorised. It hasn't been examined in terms of biography. I mean, I'm not saying that there's not a lot of work done, but I think if you compare with the histories of other places, it is not been nearly as thoroughly examined, at least by comparison with the range of sources that are available, because China has had an immense amount of historical sources. In fact, until the 18th century, it had more books published than the rest of the world put together. That, of course, is not the case after that time, but it certainly was at one time the case. It's an immense publishing civilization. Now, I've got 2 points I want to make, which are the burden of my talk. Firstly, is to emphasize the importance of Chinese history. I suppose I've already hinted at that. I'm going to elaborate on it. And the second is to talk about the nature of biography, biographical history, because I think that's a special kind of history that is well taken up in this dictionary and could be talked about a little bit. Well, I think that Chinese history is important. I guess that's obvious from what I've said. Why should I think it's important? I think there are several reasons. Firstly, it's a very long history. Well, that point's already been made. It goes back several thousand years. Secondly, it has contributions to world civilization in patterns of thought and in areas of culture and in various other ways. It has introduced Confucianism, which is an important system of thought in the not only in China itself, but it's been exported to other parts of East Asia, and now it has become important everywhere, I think. It's also contributed to Buddhism, contributed immensely actually to Buddhism, although Buddhism doesn't come from China. There is an enormous amount of Buddhist history in China, which I think has contributed, that country has contributed as much as any other country to this religion. And in terms of ideology, it also has a major modern revolution. And I think that's extremely important. Of course, it's based on a form of Marxism-Leninism, but it has made its own contribution. And I think it's a very interesting and a very special system that is of considerable importance for the world. Now, Confucianism is a system of political morality and family relations rather than a religion. And I think it's important to say that because it seems to me that China's history, it is very much at the basis of Chinese history. Now, I'm not saying that other countries don't have political morality, or that they don't have family relations. Obviously, they do. But I think that the texture of Chinese civilization is more bound up with those things than other civilizations. And I think that that's quite an interesting contribution to the history of the world. I think it's an important contribution, actually, to the history of the world. Now, as for the modern revolution and the modern culture, now Edmund said quite a lot about that. He was talking more about the more recent period since the Cultural Revolution, the period of reform, and so I'm not going to talk about that. Although I think it is very important. But the whole nature of revolution, I think, is the way it's played out in China, has been not only dramatic, as at that point Edmund and I think Kerry also made, about how dramatic and how dynamic it has been, but I think it's also important as far as history is concerned. And I think it has not been theorised as much as it should be, not nearly as much, for example, as, say, Soviet history, Soviet Marxism-Leninism. And I think that that's something that is worth saying. Now, the next point is that China has been home to many important cultures produced over many centuries. I mean, we think of Chinese culture. It's very broad in its range, and it includes not only, well, what we might say the Han people, Hanzu, but also a lot of ethnic minorities, some of whom have cultures that are somewhat different from Han culture, and which are also very important, and I think very, very interesting and very worthwhile studying. And can I make the point about this dictionary? One of the things I like about it is how broad the range of the people that are in there are, how broad the range is. So we have emperors, of course. We've got political figures. They're important. We also have cultural figures. We have dramatists. We have painters, poets, and various other kinds of people. Musicians and so on, and I think that makes for a very good biographical dictionary. Now, the next point I want to make is about the nature of biographical history, of biography. Now, there was a time when a lot of people thought biography doesn't matter as much as trends, economic relations, political social influences, social trends, and that sort of thing. And some people tended to belittle biography for that reason. I remember thinking a bit like that myself at one time. But looking back on that, the more I see of history, the more I study of it, the more I think that that is not the case. I think that individuals do make very important contributions to history. That doesn't mean that you don't look at those other things as well. And one of the things, can I add, that I think is good about this dictionary is that it does talk about the times, that the individuals live. It talks about the kind of society that they grew up in and they lived in and they contributed to. So, I mean, it's not that those other things don't matter. But what I'm saying is that biography is extremely important for studying history because individual people and individual people who make contributions to their country's culture and to world culture and to the world as a whole, they matter a lot. And can I just add, before I finish, that the standard histories of China, the Zhengshi, of which there are 24, they're divided into 4 sections, of which biographies is much the most important. Okay, that's what the Chinese thought. In the traditional form of history, they thought that biographies were the most important, and there are far more biographies than any other chapters. Now, I don't know whether I want to agree with that, but I think it's important to say, and I think it is a very reasonable viewpoint when you're looking at history. So, can I thank you very much for inviting me to come and for inviting me to contribute to this dictionary of Chinese biography, which I take as a great honour and a great pleasure. And I think that this dictionary is going to make a very big mark. And I think it's something that we have desperately needed for a long time. And congratulations.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. So just before I invite Yin Sao from the New South Wales Art Gallery to say a few words, I wanted to open the floor up for any questions that you might have. If you do have any questions, there's a microphone that will be wandering around, I think. Is it somewhere here? Are there any questions? Ah, yes. If you just wait and then, yeah. This lady here.
Hello. It's wonderful you are doing this, but I'm just wondering, what is the proportion of women in your dictionary?
Okay. Well, the editorial team, apart from myself and one other guy, Bill, was all women. In the history, we did specifically look to have women figures. So the great Empress Wu Zetian, we have a powerful entry on her saying that she wasn't, as most traditional Chinese historiography shows her, some kind of, scheming kind of figure, but she was an amazing political figure who had a big impact on the Tang. But to be honest, I guess there are about 15 entries out of the whole 105 that are of women. 15. 15, yes. We hoped in the future to improve that, but the bottom line is that because of the gentleman up there that we've been seeing, Confucius, Chinese history has a largely male flavour until about 1949. Any other questions? Yeah, just at the back.
You could just wait for the microphone so we can grab your voice. Sorry. Thank you.
I just had a quick look at the index outside, and congratulations, of course. The number of people in the era since 1949 that are covered, about a dozen figures. Are there any ambition to continue it in maybe soft copy or in some way to keep a track of the modern, the current generation?
In fact, there is a 4th volume that will be published in 2 months, I think 2 months' time, 2 or 3 months' time, which is figures from 1979. And so that has been done part of that. We wanted to do it in 2 pieces, the period from the earliest dynasties up till 1979, and then for living figures. Because, of course, writing about living figures is always a bit more challenging in a way, as they tend to argue with what you've written. And figures that have been dead for many years, if they do argue with you, that's a bit worrying. So that will come out in 2 months, but there will not be a book launch for that. This is for all of the whole, and it's already done, it's completed, but it's just got to be physically published. So I think one of the things is from 1949, history becomes very political, and so I think it will probably in future editions be good to have more cultural figures from 1949 and more of these figures more from the sort of the margins, I suppose, people who probably were not from the political mainstream over that period, and of course figures from the Chinese diaspora. That would be a really, really good thing to do. On the actual dictionary online, you can download particular entries, so you don't have to buy the whole kind of bulky thing, or libraries don't have to so they can subscribe to the online entry, and then that will give them access to particular figures. Beg your pardon, the fourth volume, sorry? The fourth volume has about 30 entries, yes. So it's a bit disproportionate. It does have cultural figures. It has Ai Weiwei, of course. We could not have that without having Ai Weiwei. So yes, it does have Ai Weiwei. Anything else? Well, look, before I hand over to Yin Cao, and I'd like to thank the Art Gallery again, and also the City of Sydney for making this part of the Chinese New Year celebrations. I think the Year of the Horse is officially now. And we do, in fact, have a Han Dynasty. I think it's a Han Dynasty painter of horses, Han Gang, which actually you can download for free. They're smart people at the Berkshire Publishing House, aren't they? They really know how to pull all the strings. So basically, I'm really grateful to the City of Sydney for their support and for you all coming today. There are some display copies which are available outside to look at. It's a big book, so we didn't want to bring lots over to try and sort of get people interested, but I think it would be wonderful to have your feedback and other figures that we could cover in future editions. So thank you very, very much indeed for coming. Thank you to our speakers and Yin Cao. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kerry. Good afternoon. 先给大家拜年。今天是初二。Just want to say Happy New Year. Today is the second year of Chinese New Year. On behalf of the Art Gallery of New South Wales, I'm the curator of Chinese art here. Thank you very much all for coming, and also thank you all for today's speakers, and also to Professor Kerry Brown and the team at the China Study Centers for collaborating with us on this event. I just want to go back to a little bit of the history of organizing this event. I remember when Kerry wrote to me, proposed this event in September last year, and I sort of put it on the table, and somebody actually questioned whether this is art, anything to do with art, because we are an art gallery, right? And I'm glad, like Kerry, you sent this, so I went through the list, and then I'm very glad, like I argued that not only you included lots of artists, like in the painters, calligraphers, and also lots of philosophers. And we all know, we study Chinese, like art is never by its own in China. It's all, part of philosophy, part of, politics. Nothing is, political in China. So I'm glad actually we finally decided, to have this here. So, and also we're very happy to host this book launch as part of our Lunar New Year festivities. This weekend also marks the opening of a new exhibition I curated in our Asian gallery in Lower Asia. The title is The Connoisseur and the Philanthropist, 30 Years of the Sternberg Collection of Chinese Art. If you have time this afternoon, I encourage you to go to have a look, because not only because there are many beautiful artworks, and thanks for Edmund, who was here for 33 years and helped the Sternberg to support us collecting, and buying all this art, and also encouraging them to put the loan to us so we can show to the public. And also, interestingly enough, you will find many of the artworks have reference to some figures in this book. For example, you will see Zhu Nan's calligraphy, who was praising Wang Xizhi's excellence of calligraphy that is unique and powerful, superior to any before and after him. And also you'll see Qianlong's calligraphy work on display. And of course, without too much ado, I would like to invite you to go upstairs now to our modern Australian galleries on the ground level for refreshments. Thank you all for coming and have a good year. Thank you.
In which my Vice-Chancellor, Michael, may think of many things to do to me, but I'm sure I won't have that fate. Well, I think that this dictionary, which is now finished and complete, and it's an amazing tribute to the publisher, Karen Christensen, and her team, that they did this in such a short period, got the final editorial work done. This is a history that tries to make those histories, those people, those voices accessible and manageable, and to make it less intimidating. In the first 3 volumes, there are 105 entries from people from 12 countries and regions, many of them from America, many of them from China, so it's a genuine international collaborative event. The entries are from 5 to 8,000 words. There are no footnotes. Thank goodness. Footnotes sometimes can be a real problem, but they are by world-leading experts, so they are authoritative, and they've been written by, in many cases, people who have studied their areas for many, many years, some of whom are my colleagues at the University of Sydney, Jeff Regal, who unfortunately couldn't be here today as he's abroad, but also Esther Klein, who's here, and others who have managed to Chinese historical figures. There was much great scholarly literature. There was some amazing chronological histories, like the Cambridge histories, the multi-volume histories. But really, if you wanted to go somewhere accessible as your first stop, where could you go? And this discussion I had with the publisher, Karen Christensen, of Berkshire Publishing in America, really started thinking of maybe doing a dictionary of Chinese biography. The first dictionary of Chinese biography was done by Herbert Giles in 1898, and therefore was a little bit out of date. And we thought, although it was a bold idea, that we would try and do something which would involve experts and scholars from throughout the world to write maybe 100, 150 entries about key figures. Why? Well, I guess everyone knows that Chinese history is very long. Some people think it's 4,000 years, some people 5,000, but it's certainly a pretty daunting sight when you stand at the base of this vast Alps of events and happenings and you try and make sense of it. And looked at the incredible records of the historians, one of the great world classics, and I thought, well, that would be an inspiration because it's a story of the life of China, the Chinas that existed up until that period in the Han Dynasty, around about the time of Christ, 2,000 years ago, through people and people's voices. And in fact, it may well be the world's first psychohistory, psychological history. It has this sort of extraordinary way, Sima Qian, of capturing people's characters and people's habits and really telling the story of the China that existed until then through those people. It's also, most importantly, a history of stories, very vivid and very powerful stories that convey something of the nature and spirit of the times that Sima Qian was writing about. So I thought in the 21st century there probably was a role for an update of that. Not, of course, that I'm claiming that I'm Sima Qian, not least because he ended up castrated. He offended the emperor. I'm sure there are many days. And really, the only thing that helps us in the journey through this history is chronology. It has a beginning, and it's kind of going on now, so we can say that now is, at least for the moment, the end. And this is an alien culture in many ways, not an alien in a nasty sense, but alien in as much as many of the names are very hard to remember, many of the cultural symbols, many of the kind of contexts are difficult to understand for those who are not born in this culture. And therefore, if you have chronology, that's about the only thing that helps you through. There are no easy threads, as I say in the introduction. The dynasties fragment sometimes. There's no simple way of saying that at one particular point, for instance, about 1,000 years ago at the end of the Great Tang Dynasty, there was a sort of moment of a kind of multiple Chinas, and therefore lots and lots of opportunity for confusion. And therefore, we really kind of have to keep track of that timeline. But how do we do it? Well, I looked at the great historian Sima Qian from the Han Dynasty 2,000 years ago. Before I introduce our distinguished speakers, I'd like to thank the Art Gallery of New South Wales. I'd also like to thank the speakers for, in one case, coming from Brisbane. And I would also like to thank all of you for coming today. This is a day I never thought I would ever see, partly because you're here, but also because this project started in a conversation in London about 6 years ago, when I was looking at the opening ceremony of the Olympics, if you remember that year, and remembering all of the kind of great pageant of Chinese history that was being shown then, and thinking how much of this, how many of these figures that are being shown in front of a global audience would really make a great deal of sense to those who were not Chinese. And it made me think actually that there were very few places that you could go to get a straightforward, simple guide to Chinese figures